Welcome back to the continuation of where we left off in the previous video, where I talked about how the French influenced America and became chummy with the native Indians, making big bucks with the fur trade back in Europe. Alright, let's get started. By 1750, North America looked something like this. You had the English colonies scattered along the east coast, the French hanging out up in Canada and down in Louisiana, and the Spanish chilling in Florida, Texas, and New Mexico. Now before we dive in, here's a clearer picture because this setup is going to lead to some drama. First, let's talk populations. The English colonies were all about the land grab. The logic was simple. Get here, get land. Thanks to the unfortunate deaths of Native Americans from disease and being pushed west, land was in abundance. If you could just secure passage across the ocean, you were golden. And once there, the English went full baby boom mode. Disease wasn't as bad up north, so people were cranking out kids like it was their side hustle, especially the Puritans in New England. Their population soared because, well, nothing says, "I love religious freedom," like a house full of children. By 1750, the English colonies had over 1 million people, maybe even 1.5 million. Compare that to the French. Sure, the map makes it look like they had a ton of land, but looks can be deceiving. The French weren't exactly populating their territory in droves. They had some fur traders wandering about, a few missionaries doing their thing, and a handful of soldiers. But that's about it. Their population, a modest 70,000, maybe 80,000 tops. Now let's look at Louisiana. The French had only started settling there in the early 1700s, and by 1750, they had around 20,000 people. Why so few? Disease. And unlike the English, they weren't popping out enough kids to replace the losses. As for the Spanish, they had a similar situation in what's now the U.S. They had a small presence in Florida, mostly soldiers guarding forts, and while they had missions here and there, they didn't have a ton of people. Most of the action was happening further south in New Spain, Mexico. In Texas and New Mexico, they had a few missionaries, a handful of converted Native Americans, and a smattering of soldiers trying to keep the French from expanding. Not exactly a hot spot for Spanish settlers looking to strike it rich. By 1750, Spanish New Mexico's population had actually declined, even though they'd converted quite a few Pueblo Indians. Still, estimates put the Spanish population around 40,000 to 50,000 in these areas. So, to recap, the English had a booming population with over 1 million people, the French around 80,000, the Spanish not much more, and yet the English and French were about to go toe-to-toe over North America. On paper, it doesn't look like much of a contest, 1 million versus 80,000, but as we'll see, the French had some tricks up their sleeves. So, before we dive into the big showdown of the 7 Years' War, let's set the stage. By the 1750s, the British, yes, British, because by now they've expanded their brand and incorporated Scotland, parts of Ireland, and colonies in Africa and India, are a major global power. They've outpaced Spain by a long shot. Remember when they took down the Spanish Armada back in the 1680s? Well, despite Spain throwing a ton of money into its navy since then, the British merchant fleet just kept growing, leaving the Spanish in their wake. Eventually, Britain went all in on a military navy, making them the dominant naval power of the time, which they used to snag Caribbean territories from Spain. Meanwhile, Spain had been on the decline. They'd been overspending on religious wars, bureaucracy, and overexpansion, and even though they were still raking in silver from the Americas, their military couldn't keep up. By the mid-1700s, Spain was losing steam, and Britain and France were locked in a fierce rivalry to be the world's top dog. Now, while Britain had the sea covered, France was flexing its muscles on land. The French were building up their military might in Europe and expanding their empire by forging alliances and controlling large swaths of land. In North America, they weren't doing too badly either. Though they weren't quite as cash flush as the British, they had a profitable fur trade in Canada and were making a killing, literally, with sugar production in Haiti, which had become a veritable gold mine for them. Both the British and French were turning their overseas profits into military powerhouses, Britain investing in its navy, and France with its land armies and cutting-edge military strategies, thanks to their obsession with science and being at the forefront of military innovation. So what do you get when two powerhouses are on the rise and one is on the decline? A whole lot of wars. Throughout the 1700s, Britain and France were basically fighting each other on a regular basis. These wars had a variety of names, like the War of Spanish Succession and the War of Austrian Succession, but they all boiled down to the same thing: we want what you have. They fought over European crowns, trade routes, and territorial expansion. And while these wars were serious business in Europe, they rarely spilled over into North America. For the most part, European wars were like background noise to the American colonies. You might see the British attempt a quick raid on St. Augustine, or the French get some native allies to launch a few skirmishes on British settlements, but nothing major came of it. It was kind of like when two neighbors are having a huge argument and you just hear muffled shouting through the walls. You know something's happening, but it doesn't really affect your day. The one exception to this was during the War of Austrian Succession, when Britain took Nova Scotia, which used to be French territory. They claimed the land, but interestingly, didn't bother to move the French settlers, the Acadians. It was more like, okay, this is ours now, but you can stay if you want. Casual, right? So to sum it up, Britain and France were constantly at each other's throats in Europe, but the Americas stayed relatively quiet until, of course, the 7 Years' War, which was about to change everything. Up until the 1750s, most of the fighting between Britain and France hadn't really touched the American colonies. Sure, a few territories in the Caribbean changed hands, but for the most part, it was business as usual in the Americas. All of that changes in 1753. This time, the conflict doesn't just affect North America, it starts here, in a place between the British and French colonies that we now call the Ohio Valley. By 1753, things were getting a little crowded on the Atlantic coast. British colonists had been rapidly filling up available land east of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, not every inch was claimed, but a huge chunk of it was spoken for. Land wasn't free anymore either, like it had been in the early days of colonization. While it was still cheaper than in England, it wasn't the bargain it used to be. Plus, cash crops, particularly tobacco, were taking their toll on the soil. You could only grow tobacco in one place for a couple of years before it drained the land of nitrogen, which meant constantly needing fresh land to keep the crops growing. At first, this wasn't an issue because there was plenty of land available, thanks in large part to disease wiping out native populations and British forces pushing them west. But by the 1750s, prime real estate east of the Appalachians was either used up, more expensive, or no longer good for tobacco, so naturally English settlers began to look west toward the Ohio Valley, a region full of fertile land that hadn't been heavily settled yet. Sure, there were a few French fur traders and some forts scattered around, but for the most part, the area seemed wide open. One of the people eyeing this land was a 21-year-old kid named George Washington. Now, Washington wasn't the mythic figure we think of today with the wig and stoic expression. Back then, he was a young man from a wealthy Virginia family that had made its fortune in tobacco. The Washingtons owned a lot of land and had purchased a significant number of enslaved people to work that land, making them one of the more well-to-do families in the region. This wealth allowed them to give young George an education that most people in the South didn't have access to at the time. Sure, New England had high literacy rates, but down in the southern colonies, the only people with that level of education were wealthy families like the Washingtons. With his education, George Washington took up a job as a land surveyor. Basically, he'd go out and map land for speculators. And speaking of speculators, these folks were the middlemen between the British Crown and settlers in the colonies. Here's how it worked. If the British fought with a Native American group and the British won, the natives would be forced to move west and sign over their land, not directly to settlers, but to the King of England. Now, the king didn't exactly know what to do with this random chunk of land in the colonies. He probably wasn't even aware of the skirmish that had taken place to get it. So he'd sell or grant the land to speculators, who would then carve it up and sell it to individual settlers looking to make a new life on the frontier. In some cases, this was handled at the state level. For example, Virginia might take control of newly acquired land. So, at this point, the land acquisition process was pretty straightforward. The governor of Virginia, like many colonial governors, would negotiate with local Native American groups, often after conflicts or skirmishes. The natives, forced to give up their land, would sign it over to the British Crown. The governor, acting on behalf of the king, would then facilitate the sale of this land to land speculators. These speculators, in turn, would subdivide the land into smaller plots, maybe 60 acres or so, and sell it to individual settlers. Of course, someone had to map these plots of land, and that's where a young George Washington came in. As a well-educated young man, Washington had the skills needed for land surveying, which made him a valuable asset. He had already gained experience mapping land, some of which took him west of the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio Valley. So, when the time came to explore the region further for potential land acquisitions, Washington was a natural choice for the job. However, in 1753, things took a more serious turn. The governor of Virginia, seeing the potential of the fertile Ohio Valley, wanted to claim it for the British. Now, this wasn't a decision made with approval from the British Crown. In fact, it's possible that the governor had a personal interest in the matter. He had connections to land speculators and may have seen this as an opportunity to expand the land available for sale. Some have suggested he might have been hoping to provoke a conflict with the French, knowing that if the British government stepped in, they could seize the Ohio Valley and provide a huge chunk of land to sell to settlers. But whether his intentions were driven by personal gain or by a genuine belief that the land should belong to the British, the governor made his move. Without official authorization, he sent young George Washington on a mission. His task? Head west to the Ohio Valley, locate the nearest French fort, and inform the French commander that the land was now under British control. It was a bold move, considering the British and French had only recently wrapped up the War of Austrian Succession. The tension between the two nations was still high, and now Washington, a 21-year-old kid, was about to deliver a message that could spark a new conflict. So Washington made his way into the Ohio Valley. After crossing the Appalachian Mountains, he eventually found a French fort. Picture Washington arriving at the fort's gates, knocking and waiting as a French officer approaches. The French commander, likely a battle-hardened veteran, looks down at this young man, wondering what he's doing there. Washington, delivering the message from the governor of Virginia, tells the French commander that the Ohio Valley is now British territory and the French need to pack up and leave, but the French commander is having none of it. The French had been in the region for about 100 years, trading with the local Native American tribes and establishing fur trading posts and forts. As far as the French were concerned, this was their land. In response, the French officer likely smirked and told Washington in no uncertain terms to go back to Virginia and inform the governor that they weren't going anywhere. The French had been trading and building relationships with the native peoples in the region for generations, and they weren't about to abandon their claims because of a message from a young British envoy. Imagine the scene. Washington, out of his element, and facing a seasoned French officer, is turned away, figuratively kicked in the rear, and sent back east to relay the French commander's message to the governor of Virginia. Though the French didn't physically kick him, it must have felt like a significant setback. So George Washington returns to the governor of Virginia in 1753 with news that the French commander refused to recognize British claims to the Ohio Valley. Washington explains that, after delivering the message, the French commander essentially kicked him out, telling him to go back and inform the governor that the French weren't going anywhere. This was a clear rejection, and it set the stage for further conflict between the British and the French over this contested land. At this point, the governor of Virginia decided to escalate the situation. He told Washington to gather 100 professional British soldiers, known as Redcoats, along with 200 militiamen, who were essentially local farmers and craftsmen temporarily armed for military duty. The governor's plan was to send this force to the Ohio Valley and have them stake a claim for the British by building a fort. Specifically, he wanted Washington to go to a strategic location where three rivers converged, a spot we know today as Pittsburgh. The idea was to go as far west as possible, just east of the French forts, and claim the surrounding land for the British. If the French weren't going to leave, the governor reasoned, the British would simply build forts and claim as much territory as they could. In 1754, Washington set out with his 300 men to build this fort, but when he arrived at the intended location, he was met with an unpleasant surprise. While he had been gone, the French had anticipated the British move and constructed their own fort in the exact same spot. This fort, called Fort Duquesne, was strategically placed to prevent the British from advancing further west. Washington, standing there with his men, realized that he couldn't build his fort where he had planned because the French had beaten him to it. Now, in a tough situation, Washington was left wondering what to do next. Unfortunately, his next move would be a major blemish on his otherwise distinguished career. Even though Britain and France were technically not at war at this point, despite lingering tensions from the War of Austrian Succession, Washington made the fateful decision to attack a French patrol from Fort Duquesne. The French, doing routine patrols of the area, had sent out a small group of about 20 men. Washington and his forces ambushed the patrol, killing several French soldiers. Some of the French managed to escape and report back to Fort Duquesne that the British had attacked them. This was a serious blunder. Washington had just initiated armed conflict in an area that the French believed was rightfully theirs. Now, with the French aware of the attack, Washington knew that retaliation was imminent. Worse yet, he also knew that the French would likely bring their Native American allies with them, as the French generally had better relationships with local tribes. The Native Americans, many of whom had already been pushed west by British settlers, weren't going to take kindly to the idea of British expansion into the Ohio Valley. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Washington knew he had to act quickly. He needed to build a defensive position, a fort, to protect himself and his men from the inevitable French counterattack. Unfortunately, the location where he had planned to build his fort was no longer an option, as the French had already claimed it with Fort Duquesne. So Washington looked for an alternative site. In his rush to establish a fort before the French arrived, Washington made a series of poor decisions. Instead of choosing a location that was defensible, perhaps on elevated ground or near water, with natural barriers to help fend off an attack, he picked a spot that was strategically weak. The fort, which he hastily named Fort Necessity, was built in a low, swampy area surrounded by trees that would allow enemy forces to hide as they advanced. Washington's lack of military experience showed. A well-designed fort would have been positioned on higher ground, giving the defenders a better vantage point to see and attack any approaching enemy. It would have had fewer obstacles like trees to allow for clear lines of sight. Ideally, it would have been located near a water source and perhaps even had natural defenses such as cliffs or hills to prevent easy access. But Fort Necessity was none of these things. It was a poorly chosen site that left Washington and his men vulnerable to the French and their Native American allies, who were surely on their way. Fort Necessity was a disaster waiting to happen. Washington had built it in a valley surrounded by hills and dense trees, which made it a perfect target for the French and their Native American allies. On July 3, 1754, they arrived bringing with them 600 French soldiers, many of whom were professional troops, as well as Native American warriors who were well versed in the terrain. The French army was among the best trained military forces in the world at the time, and their native allies gave them a strategic advantage, knowing the land well and utilizing guerrilla-style tactics. Washington's forces, on the other hand, were a mixed bag. He had 100 British redcoats, professional soldiers who had signed up for service and trained regularly. These redcoats, though perhaps not as experienced as the French, were still disciplined and prepared for combat. Their training involved learning to stay calm under fire, knowing when to advance, and working together as a unit. These men were conditioned to charge toward danger rather than retreat. Unfortunately for Washington, the bulk of his forces, about 200 men, were colonial militiamen. These men were not trained soldiers. They were farmers, carpenters, blacksmiths, and other tradesmen who had been called up to fight. When conflicts with Native American tribes broke out in the colonies, these local militias were often raised to respond. But fighting against native tribes, who often had inferior technology, was one thing. Going up against a professional European army like the French was something entirely different. The militiamen weren't trained to deal with the chaos of battle. When gunfire started, they did what any ordinary person might do: they panicked. Without formal training, they were prone to hiding, running away, or, in some cases, losing morale completely. In this case, many of them were reported to be drinking heavily, crying, and becoming increasingly useless as the battle unfolded. The French, having the high ground, took full advantage of Washington's poor fort placement. From the hills surrounding Fort Necessity, they were able to fire down into the fort. The trees around the area provided cover for the French and their native allies, allowing them to move in closer without being easily spotted. Inside the fort, Washington's men were being picked off, one by one. Realizing the fort was poorly situated for defense, the British redcoats made the decision to leave the safety of the fort's walls and engage the French out in the open. They thought they might stand a better chance fighting head-on, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. The French and their allies held the advantage in both position and numbers, and the British soldiers found themselves overwhelmed. Meanwhile, inside the fort, chaos reigned. The militia had all but given up. With little to no battle experience, they simply couldn't hold up under the pressure. While the professional soldiers tried to maintain some semblance of order, it was clear that the situation was spiraling out of control. Washington himself wasn't unscathed. In the thick of the battle, his horse was shot out from under him and a bullet passed through his coat, narrowly missing him. But despite his personal bravery, it became obvious that the British had no chance of winning. His men were falling all around him, and the French, with their superior numbers and better position, continued to close in. By July 4th, Washington knew the battle was lost. His forces were decimated, and Fort Necessity was completely vulnerable to attack. Faced with no other option, Washington was forced to consider surrender. On July 4th, 1754, George Washington surrendered Fort Necessity to the French. Although the French didn't kill him or his men, they did humiliate them. In many instances like this, the French would strip the captured soldiers of their weapons, uniforms, and any valuable clothing before sending them back. Imagine Washington, having just surrendered, trudging back to the Virginia governor wearing nothing but his 1700s puffy underwear, stripped of his dignity after the French had kicked his butt. To add insult to injury, right after Washington turned over Fort Necessity, the French looked at it and thought, "We don't even want this." The fort was so poorly constructed that the French decided to just destroy it. They didn't need it anyway. They already had a better built fort up the river, Fort Duquesne. So they tore Washington's fort down and left the site. Now Washington had to go back to the governor of Virginia and report what had happened. He told him, "The French kicked my butt, killed a bunch of my men, and took my clothes and guns. They're a bunch of jerks. Oh, and they destroyed the fort too." Once again, Washington had been driven out of the Ohio Valley by the French in a region that the French claimed as their own. Back in Virginia, people started to call on the governor to escalate the situation, asking, "Why don't we just go to war?" But while this was a major incident in the colonies, the British Parliament and the King back in England weren't as eager to get involved. Having just come out of a costly war with France, the War of Austrian Succession, they were hesitant to start another conflict. For now, the British leadership decided this wasn't worth going to war over. The Ohio Valley seemed distant and less critical to them, so from 1754 to 1756, the British and French found themselves in a tense, uneasy relationship, like two brothers who didn't want to start a full-on fistfight, knowing it would lead to trouble. They started to engage in petty provocations, getting in each other's faces but stopping short of throwing punches. One thing the British did during this time was give private citizens, especially merchants, the green light to capture French vessels at sea. So if you were a British merchant or a privateer and you came across a French ship, you could capture it. It wasn't official warfare, just private citizens doing what they wanted. This was an attempt to annoy the French without officially declaring war. Naturally, the French retaliated, giving their own merchants the same permission. So, while neither government wanted a full-scale war just yet, their private citizens were busy capturing each other's ships, kind of like poking each other, trying to provoke a response. Another significant move the British made was to address the French presence in Nova Scotia, or Acadia. This area had been home to about 10,000 French settlers, known as Acadians, but at the end of the War of Austrian Succession, France had been forced to cede Nova Scotia to the British. Initially, the British had left the Acadians alone, thinking they were just a bunch of farmers and not a real threat. However, by 1755, tensions with France were growing, and the British became increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of 10,000 French citizens living in a strategically important area. They didn't want these Acadians turning on them if war broke out with France, so the British gave them an ultimatum: leave. The Acadians were faced with a tough choice. Many of them had been born in Acadia, and it was the only home they had ever known. Some Acadians decided to leave for France, but many had no connection to the country anymore. A handful moved to Canada, where the French still held power, but others began to look for new opportunities elsewhere. One destination that started to gain attention was Louisiana, where the French still controlled land. With a decent amount of land still available in Louisiana, about 5,000 Acadians were forced to relocate. The British told them they couldn't stay in Nova Scotia, so many decided to pack up and head to French-controlled Louisiana, hoping to continue their lives under the French flag. However, when they arrived, they found that much of the prime land, the fertile areas along the Mississippi River, was already taken. Instead, many Acadians were forced to settle in swampy, less desirable areas. Once in Louisiana, the Acadians began importing the culture they had developed in Acadia. For example, wheat was a staple in their diet, and they were used to making their distinctive Acadian bread. But when they arrived in Louisiana, they found the local French settlers growing crops like corn, okra, and rice. Not exactly to their taste, Still, they tried to make their old ways work in this new environment. This blending of Acadian culture with the Louisiana French way of life led to a unique fusion that gave rise to what we now know as Cajun culture. The Acadians, or Cajuns as they became known, adapted to life in the swamps, and over time this Canadian French culture mixed with the Louisiana French traditions and indigenous influences. So, when you visit New Orleans and enjoy dishes like beignets, po' boys, or shrimp, you're experiencing a culinary blend that traces its roots back to the Acadian migration. The bread for those famous po' boys, for example, was brought by the Acadians. While the British were busy deporting the Acadians, the French were busy poking back at the British. In 1755 and 1756, the French began encouraging their Indian allies to attack British settlements. They promised these Native American groups arms, ammunition, and supplies like gunpowder, hatchets, and knives. These tribes, already feeling pressure from British settlers pushing them further west, were more than willing to take up the French offer. A series of raids followed, with Native American groups attacking British settlers on the frontier. When the British complained, the French feigned innocence. "Hey, it's not us, it's them," they would say, claiming the attacks were solely the actions of the Native American tribes, not directly linked to French policy. This was just another way of aggravating the British while maintaining the appearance of avoiding full-scale war. Meanwhile, the British were preparing for a third military expedition. This time, General Edward Braddock was sent to capture Fort Duquesne, with George Washington once again joining the effort. Unfortunately for Washington, Braddock was killed during the expedition, and Washington had to take control of the troops. This third attempt to take Fort Duquesne also ended in disaster, with Washington suffering yet another defeat and having to return to the governor of Virginia with the news of yet another loss. Fans of the Assassin's Creed video game series might recognize this event, as the third British expedition against the French is depicted in Assassin's Creed The Fair, which starts with Braddock's failed expedition into French territory. So, by 1756, the situation had escalated significantly. Both the British and the French were fighting at sea, with the French using their Native American allies as proxies to attack British colonists, and the British forcing the Acadians out of Nova Scotia. The tension had reached a boiling point. They had provoked each other enough that both sides finally decided it was time to go to full war. The two nations may have wanted to avoid another conflict so soon after the War of Austrian Succession, but by 1756 it was inevitable. Thus, the 7 Years' War officially began in 1756. Although it's called the 7 Years' War, fighting had been going on since 1754, making it closer to 9 years of conflict. This war, fought between Britain and France, would ultimately reshape the global balance of power. Interestingly, this conflict is also known as the French and Indian War, though that name is less commonly used today. The name can be misleading since it suggests a war between the French and the Indians, but in reality, most Native American tribes sided with the French due to their long-established trade relationships. Only a handful of native groups aligned with the British, while most fought alongside the French. While most Native American tribes had good relationships with the French or disliked the British for pushing them west, they largely sided with the French during this conflict, so calling it the French and Indian War doesn't entirely make sense. A more accurate name might be the French and Indian versus British War. However, the term 7 Years' War is generally preferred, not only for its historical accuracy, but because it reflects the true global scope of the conflict. Referring to it solely as the French and Indian War also implies that the fighting was limited to North America, which was far from the truth. The conflict spanned across the world, with battles taking place in the Caribbean, Europe, Africa, India, and even Asia. When war was officially declared between Britain and France, both nations sought alliances. The French aligned with Spain. while the British gained support from Portugal and Prussia. Russia sided with France, further intensifying the conflict. What emerged was essentially the First Global War, with skirmishes breaking out in colonial territories across multiple continents, from the coastlines of Africa to the East Indies. Some historians even consider the 7 Years' War to be the first true world war because of how widespread the fighting was. There were battles in West Africa near coastal slave colonies, conflicts between French and British forces in India, and naval clashes in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Setting the global picture aside, both Britain and France entered this war with their own distinct advantages and disadvantages. Britain, for example, had a significant numerical advantage in the colonies, with over 1 million British colonists compared to around 70,000 to 80,000 French settlers. This population disparity gave the British a ratio of roughly 15-1 over the French in North America. Additionally, the British boasted naval superiority. Their vast merchant fleet and powerful navy, which had been expanding for years, gave them the upper hand in controlling the seas. While the French had also built a respectable navy, it couldn't match the British. However, the French had advantages of their own. First, they had more professional soldiers stationed in the New World compared to the British, who largely relied on colonists to defend their territory. Many of these colonists didn't feel it was their responsibility to engage in European-style warfare, preferring instead to focus on defending their homes from Native American threats. They believed it was the job of professional British soldiers to fight these larger wars. But in North America, the French had better trained and more experienced military forces, and they were well versed in scientific and tactical warfare. Another significant advantage for the French was their strong alliances with Native American tribes. While some tribes chose to stay neutral, particularly those in the Mississippi region, the majority of Native Americans who joined the conflict sided with the French. So, while the British had superior numbers, the French had an edge with more professional soldiers and greater Native American support. This was apparent almost immediately when the French decided to go on the offensive. In 1756, rather than waiting for the British to attack, the French began sending their professional troops to capture British territory. They reached out to their Native American allies, promising them firearms, trade goods, and other valuable resources in exchange for their help. Many Native Americans joined the French, drawn by the opportunity for loot, revenge on the British, or simply the chance to secure weapons that would help protect their families and communities. Together, the French and their Native American allies began targeting British forts. Between late 1756 and early 1757, they captured one British fort after another. The French strategy was straightforward. They would surround British forts, which were often defended by only a handful of professional soldiers. These soldiers, outnumbered and outmatched, had little choice but to surrender when the French forces and their Native American allies encircled them. The French and their native allies surrounded British forts, giving the British an ultimatum: surrender or things are going to get ugly, especially with the threat that native allies might just go rogue and do some serious damage. Most of the British, knowing they'd be seriously outgunned, chose surrender over a battle that would leave them dead. The French seemed to be cool with that. They didn't want to lose a bunch of soldiers taking forts when they didn't have many troops to begin with, so the British gave up their forts, handed over their weapons, and then the French would give those weapons to their native allies as a kind of thanks for your help deal, a share in the spoil, so to speak. The British, they'd be sent packing east with nothing but their uniforms and tails between their legs. Well, until things went a little sideways. Now let's zoom in on one particularly infamous moment: Fort William Henry, 1757. The French, along with around 8,000 native allies, roll up to this fort and demanded surrender. The British commander was down to surrender but didn't want to lose face, so he's like, sure, but we're keeping our weapons. The French commander, not eager for a bloody battle, agrees, saying, fine, but no gunpowder or ammo. Everyone seems happy with the terms, except the native allies. See, the native warriors didn't come along just for the fun of it. They expected some spoils, especially guns. When they realized the French weren't confiscating the British weapons as they'd hoped, they were not impressed and rather disappointed. So they took matters into their own hands and decided, we're taking those guns anyway. Tensions boiled over as the native warriors started disarming the British prisoners, sparking fights. What followed was chaos. British soldiers, now unarmed and defenseless, were attacked, with many being killed. To make matters worse, some of the women and children were taken as captives. The French tried to calm things down, but they were pretty unsuccessful. What was supposed to be a surrender deal turned into a brutal massacre. Now, why does this matter? Well, word about the Fort William Henry massacre spread like wildfire among the colonists, who had mostly stayed out of the fight up until now, thinking, hey, this is a job for the professionals. We'll just handle the local native issues, but let the British soldiers take care of the French. That mindset changed fast when they heard that the French and their native allies were massacring soldiers and kidnapping civilians right on their doorstep. Suddenly, militia units started forming everywhere, as colonists realized they'd better step up and help the British forces, or risk having the fight come right to their front lawns. The massacre at Fort William Henry scared the colonists into action, pulling them into a conflict they'd largely sat out of until that point. And, interestingly enough, the French were worried this would happen. They feared that this kind of attack would freak out the colonists and bring more militia support to the British Army. So, in a way, the very thing they feared became a reality as the colonies ramped up their involvement in the war. The French started rethinking their alliance with Native American tribes after the Fort William Henry massacre. They realized that while these allies were great for fighting battles, the unpredictability and tensions between the French and their native partners were causing a major headache. The French worried that if this kept up, it would just give the British colonists more reasons to join militias and fight back. So the French gradually distanced themselves from their native allies, cutting back on joint operations. At first, that might have seemed like a smart move, but it backfired big time. The French were already outnumbered by the British, and losing their native allies only made things worse. Meanwhile, the British colonists were rallying to the cause, with militias joining the professional army, tilting the numbers even more in Britain's favor. By 1757 and 1758, those newly bolstered British forces started reclaiming forts the French had taken, and the tide of the war shifted. The French, though well trained, couldn't hold out forever. Sure, there are stories of a few hundred French troops taking on tens of thousands of British and militia soldiers and winning, but let's be real, that's not sustainable. You can't keep pulling off miracle victories when you're massively outnumbered. One loss after another piled up, and by 1759 the British had momentum on their side, pushing into French Canada. And just as the French were running low on reinforcements and supplies, the British at home kicked their war effort into overdrive. The British government started borrowing money like a shopaholic with a new credit card, hiring more soldiers and building more ships. They blockaded French Canada, cutting off supplies along the vital St. Lawrence River. The French settlers there found themselves running out of basic necessities, including gunpowder. To make matters worse for France, their king decided, hey, North America's not that important. Let's focus on beating the British in Europe. We'll win over there and get something out of it when we negotiate peace. Bold strategy, but spoiler alert, it didn't work. By 1759 and 1760, British forces were taking Quebec and Montreal, and the war in North America was all but over. The British didn't bother going for French Louisiana, but they did take the key cities in New France, effectively crippling French control in North America. The war, though, dragged on elsewhere for a few more years, notably in Europe and the Caribbean. The British even captured Havana from the Spanish, dealing a huge blow to Spanish trade in the region. Finally, in 1763, everyone decided they'd had enough. The British, French, and Spanish sat down and hammered out the Treaty of Paris. And no, this wasn't the only Treaty of Paris. History seems to love naming treaties after that city. But this one, signed in 1763, officially ended the 7 Years' War. So, what did the Treaty of Paris do? Well, first, it handed a ton of territory over to the British. The French had lost their hold on most of their North American lands, including Canada. As for Louisiana, the French didn't technically lose it in the war, but they decided it wasn't worth keeping either. With British control over the Mississippi trade routes, the French figured, why hang on to Louisiana? It's not going to be profitable anymore. So the French ended up ceding Louisiana too. The 7 Years' War reshaped the map, giving Britain huge new chunks of land. It also set the stage for future conflicts, like, say, that whole American Revolution thing, but that's a story for another day. With all the trade goods drying up and the French no longer in control of key areas, they realized Louisiana wasn't exactly a gold mine. Maintaining it meant more money spent on soldiers, resources, and management. So they had a simple solution: offer it to Spain. Hey Spain, do you want Louisiana? Because we sure don't. At first, Spain wasn't thrilled about the idea. Taking on Louisiana seemed like a massive expense, especially after losing Florida to the British. But then the French sweetened the deal with a little nudge. Well, if you don't take it, the British will, and they'll be right next to your silver mines. Suddenly, the idea of Louisiana didn't seem so bad, so Spain took it. That's why, if you wander through Louisiana today, you'll see Spanish influences alongside the French Quarter, streets and architecture reflecting Spanish rule, which lasted from 1763 to 1800. Interestingly, though, even when Spain took control, the French population stuck around. The same thing happened in Canada. The British didn't kick out the French residents, they just took over governance. The French-speaking population was allowed to stay, keep speaking French, and practice Catholicism, but they were now under British rule. This is how, by the end of the 7 Years' War, the British found themselves in control of the eastern half of North America, while the French were completely gone from the continent. They still had some Caribbean sugar islands like Haiti, but New France was history. Meanwhile, Spain got Louisiana, but it wasn't exactly the most profitable piece of real estate. Two key things resulted from this major land reshuffling. Native American tribes, especially those in the north, were left in a tough spot. The French had been their key trading partner, supplying them with guns and goods. With the French gone, many tribes could no longer play the French and British against each other. They lost a powerful ally, which left them in a vulnerable position. The British were now swimming in debt. Before the 7 Years' War, Britain's national debt stood at a manageable £5 million. By the end, though, they were a whopping £133 million in the red. That's a lot of zeros. So, guess who the British thought should help foot the bill? Their American colonies, of course. And this, my friend, sets the stage for some serious tension, one that will eventually boil over into the American Revolution. But that's a story for another day.